Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's life science lesson. My name is Shabnam Sukhnandan. This lesson is brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with the Saibono Discovery Center. Grade 12 learners, today's lesson is going to be on evolution, the second part of it that deals with evolution by natural selection. I'm going to be presenting the first part. My name is Shabnam Sukhnandan and my co-presenter will be Agnes Maibello, who will deal with you with the other parts of evolution. So let us now look at evolution by natural selection. First of all, learners, always remember that for whatever topic you learn in grade 12, there is an exam guideline. This exam guideline is actually a scope to the depth of the topics you need to know. So please always check your exam guideline and ensure that you know everything before you actually sit and write the paper. So now the first part of the exam guideline on evolution is about the origin of an idea about evolution, and what you need to know for this ideas on evolution is the theories behind the evolution process. And the ideas on evolution in order of the origin are as follows. It's Lamarckism, Darwinism, and punctuated equilibrium. These are three theories or ideas that was proposed on how evolution actually began, or is there something called evolution. So these theories, you need to know them. Then you're going to look at Lamarckism. That means the theory of Lamarckism or the law of Lamarckism. Who actually founded or proposed that law was Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. And he existed from 1744 to 1829. So Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck was the one that proposed the theory of evolution relating to Lamarckism. We're going to see in depth what exactly is Lamarckism later. Now you see, Lamarck used two laws to explain evolution. You need to know the two laws. So in this exam guideline, it's telling you that Lamarck used the two laws, and these two laws altogether, what was it? If they ask you in a biological term, Lamarck's two laws of evolution, you think now, what must I write, because it's just a biological term. Lamarck's two laws, you need to know it. But the laws, both the laws together are referred to as Lamarckism. Okay? And the two laws are the law of use and disuse. That's what you need to know. And the law of inheritance of acquired characteristics. So these two laws in red, law of use and disuse and law of inheritance of acquired characteristics, we're going to see it furthermore in detail later. Okay. Now let us look at Darwinism. Remember we said it's Lamarckism, Darwinism, and punctuated equilibrium are the ideas on evolution. Now let's start off with Darwinism. So Charles Darwin, learners, proposed an idea of evolution, and his idea was that based on natural selection. So his theory was based on natural selection. Don't forget, something only becomes a theory if it is supported by laws and by evidence, if it is tested and tried by scientists, and every time they have the same results, then only they can call it a theory. So Charles Darwin's proposal on natural selection was supported by evidence, and therefore it became a theory. So let's look at the theory of natural selection. This is just a general idea of natural selection, but in the exam paper, you need to take this general idea and apply it to the question. So let's see, what is Charles Darwin's idea of natural selection? He said that there is a great deal of variation amongst the offspring. A great deal of variation in the offspring. First of all, understand what is the word variation. The word variation comes from the word variety, differences. So he's saying that in all populations, there is a variety, there's a variation in the offspring. That means in one population, all those individuals, all those offspring have something that is different to each other. So there's a great deal of variation in a population. Okay? Some have favorable characteristics and some do not. So some of the offsprings will have something, genetic traits that are favorable, suitable to the environment, and some are not. Right. When there's a change in the environmental conditions, or if there's competition, we can also call it selection pressure. He said now, there's a great deal of variation in the offsprings of a population. Some of them have favorable characteristics and others do not have favorable characteristics. Now, while they're living in a certain place, remember the environment is going to change. So because of the changing environment, it's going to put some pressure on those offsprings. There could be competition, there could be predation, there could be a changes in the diet and changes in the temperature. So the conditions of the environment or competition will add pressure to this population, okay? So when there's a change in the environment or if there's competition, then the organisms with the characteristics which make them more suited will survive. S for suited, S for survive. So now, amongst these individuals with variation, the ones with the most suitable characteristics for that changing environment, they will survive. And the ones which do not have favorable characteristics to suit that environment, obviously they're going to die off. So, whilst organisms with the unfavorable characteristics or unsuitable or disadvantageous characteristics will make them less suited and they will die. Now, what happens to those that have suitable characteristics and they survive? The organisms that survive will reproduce because now they are alive, so they have the ability or the chance to mate with each other, interbreed, and produce more offspring. The organisms that survive reproduce and therefore pass on the allele for the favorable characteristic to their offspring. So you must remember, for every characteristic which we call a gene, there are two forms of the gene which we call alleles, right? Now every offspring inherits one allele of that gene or characteristic. So those organisms that survive are having that advantageous characteristic. So one allele of that advantageous characteristic goes to the offspring. So therefore, once they survive, they will pass on the allele for the favorable characteristic to the offspring. And therefore, the next generation will have a higher proportion of individuals with a favorable characteristic. Learners, I want to go through this now slowly one more time because every single paper must test you on Darwin's theory of natural selection. If they do not give you an example and they just say, explain Darwin's theory of natural selection, then you're going to explain it generally like this. But if they give you a scenario, whether it's frogs or snakes or butterflies with wings or without wings or whatever color, then you got to use that example that they give you in the question paper using this general one. You use the general and apply it to that example in the question paper. So I'm just going to go through the general one more time. You must remember, they must say that there is, of that, populations produce a large number of offsprings. In other words, every population can't just produce one or two offspring. There's a large number. So every population produces a large number of offspring. 2, there is a great deal of variation in the offsprings. 3, that some of the offsprings have advantageous characteristics and they will survive, and those that have disadvantageous characteristics will die. And then you also need to know that those that have advantageous characteristics, what is it advantageous to? For what? Is it for camouflage or what? So those that have the advantageous characteristics will survive and they will be able to reproduce, and therefore the allele for the advantageous characteristic will be passed on to the offspring, so that the next generation of offspring have a more suitable characteristic than the previous one. Okay. Now we're going to look at punctuated equilibrium. Now, punctuated equilibrium is actually proposing the speed or the rate at which evolution takes place. Remember, evolution simply means changes in the structure and behavior of organisms over time. From what we descended to now, there's been changes in the structure and the behavior of organisms over time. So now, Niles Eldredge and Stone Gould were the two scientists that proposed the idea of how fast do these changes occur in a population. How fast does evolution take place, the changes in a population occur? Remember, evolution, the changes occur due to mutations. and this affects your genes. Changes in genes lead to mutations, but how fast does it occur, these changes in a population? So we call that time, the speed at which evolution occurs, it's called punctuated equilibrium. And it basically looks like that graph line on an ECG when you're doing a cardiogram. You know, long periods of no change, called gradualism or equilibrium, followed by short periods of rapid changes. Long periods of no change in a population, followed by short periods of rapid changes, just like a cardiogram. And this is called actually punctuated equilibrium. Sometimes in a graph, they can show it to you like this. Long periods of no change followed by rapid changes. Long periods of no change followed by rapid changes. So when you see this and it's related to evolution, remember it's relating to punctuated equilibrium. Who's the two scientists? Niles Eldredge and Stone Gould. Sometimes they can just say Eldredge and Gould. So let us see how to define it. Punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated means rapid changes, like something in between. Punctuated equilibrium means stationary, gradualism. Punctuated equilibrium explains the speed at which evolution takes place. Okay? And then how you're going to define it. It's when evolution involves long periods of time where species do not change, or they change very gradually. So long periods of time where there's changes but it's very small. So long periods of time where there's very little or no changes, right, due to natural selection. So if there is changes, it's due to natural selection. So long periods of time where species do not change or change very little due to natural selection, and this alternates, you see, with short periods of time where rapid changes occur in a species through natural selection. And then this way, new species will form over a short period of time. So you can get, say, for example, you can get a whale. Nah? So a whale will have, like, for example, legs, and it was terrestrial, and suddenly, in just a few hundreds of years, the legs all disappeared, and now you're just going to get flippers or a fin. There's no legs anymore. And now the head, which was blunt, has become pointed. So for millions of years, the terrestrial whale had legs. And then over hundreds of years, in a shorter time, the legs just disappeared, because now you found that there's more water than land. So the legs disappeared and fins formed. So this was like a very big evolution, very big change, okay? And that is called now punctuated equilibrium. Remember, learners, that transitional fossils do not form part of punctuated equilibrium. What do we mean by that? A transitional fossil normally has characteristics of the one that existed before and after. But because punctuated equilibrium means long periods of time where there's no changes followed by sudden rapid changes, it's like a complete new change from the previous one. That's why we say punctuated equilibrium is not characterized by a transitional fossil. But remember one very important thing of this definition, and many learners got this wrong last year. They cannot just say long periods of time where there's changes in population followed by short periods of rapid changes. They have to include natural selection somewhere. So you can say long periods of time where there are no changes in a species due to natural selection, followed by rapid changes due to natural selection. Okay. So that word natural selection must be in your definition. Now we finished Darwinism. We finished punctuated equilibrium, which is the speed. Now we're going to look at the next theorist and his theory, which is based on Lamarckism, right? So Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck proposed, he wanted to explain. He wanted to explain exactly what is the theory of evolution. Right. So now he looked at the laws of use and disuse. Right. Remember, learners, we spoke of the laws of use and disuse. Here you can see a giraffe. You know, your teachers must have explained to you the giraffe. But now, before we go to an example, let us look at Lamarck's first law of use and disuse. Right. What Lamarck proposed was, as an organism uses a structure or organ more regularly, it becomes better developed or enlarged. And if an organism does not use a structure frequently, it becomes less developed or reduced in size. Very simple. Law of use means, Lamarck said that when an organism uses an organ more and more frequently, that organ becomes longer and stronger. And if it uses it less and less, it becomes less developed and eventually it will disappear. That is the part of the disuse. Okay? Law of use and disuse. So let's look at the inheritance of acquired characteristic. Look at the word inherit. When you inherit, it means you are inheriting, you are gaining the alleles or the genes from your parents. You can only gain your phenotypic characteristics from the genes that are found in the chromosomes of the sperm cell of the father and in the genes of the chromosomes of the ovum of the mother. Remember, you are formed from your parents' gametes, and the gametes have genes, and you inherit those genes. So whatever you inherit, if you inherited the tall allele from your father, he's tall, you will be tall. So you can only become tall, not because you wanted to become tall, not because you were determined to become tall, but you're tall simply because you inherited that allele. So Lamarck spoke about the inheritance of acquired characteristics, where he said that characteristics that are developed during the life of an individual. Now, when you want to develop your own characteristics, it's no more inherited, it's acquired. You changing it. You determined to change something. So characteristics that you develop during your lifespan, life of an individual, that is called an acquired characteristic. It can be passed on to their offspring. Now let's look at the slide very nicely again, learners. Lamarck's theory spoke about two laws. The law of use and disuse and the law of inheritance of acquired characteristic. Let's look at the law of use and disuse again. He said, the more an organism uses its structure or organ, the more longer or better developed it becomes. And if it uses it less and less, then it becomes less developed and will eventually disappear. That's the disuse part of it. And then he said that whatever the organism wanted to change, if it used that organ more and more or less and less, and it changed it, then that change part of the organ that it brought about will be passed on to the offspring. That is what it's calling that inheritance of acquired characteristic, where the offspring will gain the changes that you made to your body, to the body. Right? The offspring will inherit it. Now, Lamarck used the giraffe. So he took a giraffe to explain his two laws. Right? And this is what he said. He said that the ancestral giraffe, this one, the first giraffe on earth, had a short neck. It's called the ancestral giraffe. But now this ancestral giraffe was competing for food with other herbivores, like the sheep and the cow. They were feeding on the grass and all the leaves of the lower branches. But when the giraffe looked right on the top of the tallest tree, nobody was eating those leaves. So the giraffe said, I'm not going to get enough food if I'm also competing with the other herbivores. If I stretch my neck more and more and more, I'll reach the leaves of the highest branches and all the food can belong to me and I'll have no more competition. So the giraffe was determined, and it stretched its neck more and more and more. And then as it stretched its neck more and more, that's how Lamarck said, that's why giraffes of today have long necks. So he's saying that it wasn't born with a long neck. It changed its neck length over time because it wanted to suit the environment. Okay, so he said ancestral giraffes had a short neck, and as it used the neck more and more, the neck became longer. So the giraffe did that. Then because it changed it, then this long neck was now acquired. It never come from the parent. It was changed. So that became an acquired characteristic. And Lamarck said that because the giraffe changed its neck shape or length, that acquired trait now was inherited by the offspring. It was passed on to the offspring. And we know, learners, that that's not true. What you change on the outside cannot be passed on to the offspring. If you decide that I do not want to drink milk, I just want to drink Coke, it does not mean when the offspring are born, automatically they're going to be born only drinking Coke and they don't want to drink milk. Okay? So what you change on the outside cannot be passed on to the offspring, because offspring inherit characteristics from the genes in the gametes, not from the outside. So let's see. All giraffes had short necks originally. Then the giraffes frequently stretched their necks to reach for the leaves of tall trees. Their necks became longer. You can see, right? The neck became longer. And the characteristics of long necks that the giraffe acquired, made on its own, in this way was then passed on to the next generation. That is what he said. So let's see. In this statement now, where's the law of use? All the giraffes had short necks originally. They frequently stretched their necks and to reach for the tall leaves, for the leaves on the upper branches. Their necks became longer. Okay, so what is that? The law of use, and law of use and disuse. And then the characteristic of long necks acquired was passed on to the next generation or inherited. That is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So here you see Lamarck's two laws. Then, once that was inherited, forming offsprings with longer necks than the generation before. Okay, so now let us apply Lamarck's laws to an example that is given. So here we have an example taken from a past paper, and let us see what is written here. The red-bellied black snake, Pseudacus porphyriacus, and the green tree snake, Dendrophilus punctulatus, are predators. Now, children, these names may seem very difficult. You're not going to pronounce it. But what's very important for you to know, as complicating as it looks, remember that the first part is the genus of that red-bellied black snake. That's the common name, red-bellied black snake. But the scientific name is the Pseudacus porphyriacus. Okay? This Pseudacus is your genus. Porphyriacus is your species. So this red-bellied black snake and the green tree snake, and that is the scientific name for the green tree snake, right? That's the genus and that's the species. So the red-bellied black snake and the green tree snake are predators that sometimes feed on cane toads. So when you are reading, don't let the scientific name confuse you. Read it like normal. The red-bellied black snake, know that that is the scientific name for it. And the green tree snake, know that is the scientific name, are predators. That means they're going to feed on something. That sometimes feed on cane toads. Now, what is a cane toad? Cane is like a sugar cane, and a toad is a frog. Okay? So these snakes feed on frogs. So frogs are the prey, and the snakes are the predators. That's what you need to understand. The snakes consume. What is the meaning of consume? They eat. The snakes consume the toads by swallowing them whole. So they don't chew. They just simply swallow them. Right. A decrease in the average jaw of the snakes has been observed over a period of 70 years. Now, children, a cane toad, a toad is actually much larger, a larger frog than a small frog. In other words, a toad is quite big. Okay? But over 70 years, the scientists noticed that the jaws of the snakes have decreased. That means 70 years ago, those toads had very big jaws. Why? Because they could eat the toads. The snakes' jaws were very big, so they could eat the toads. So, with this change, it was also noted that the snakes could no longer swallow large cane toads. Now, think, why is this happening? Read this part here now. The snakes that used to eat the toads, sometimes feed on cane toads, and that's the name of the scientific name of the cane toad, Bufo marinus. But these toads contain a toxin that may kill them. The toads had a poison, so if the snakes ate them, the snakes would die. You see? So now the snakes were eating these toads and they were dying. So that means eventually the red-bellied snake and the green snake will become extinct. But over time now, what has happened? The snakes consume the toads by swallowing them, and a decrease in the average jaw of the snakes has been observed over 70 years. With this change, it was also noted that the snakes could no longer swallow large cane toads. This has resulted in an increase in the survival of the snakes. So the question will be, right, first of all, understand, children, why do you think that this evolution took place, the change from a large jaw of the cane toad to a smaller jaw? Obviously, it's for survival. If the snakes were to continue eating those cane toads, they'll become extinct, right? But now how do they survive? Eventually, if the jaws became smaller, even if there were cane toads around, remember those cane toads are poisonous. If the cane toads were around, they wouldn't be able to eat those cane toads, because now over time, the jaws of the snakes became smaller. So they won't be able to eat the cane toad. So therefore they will survive. Okay? Understand that part. So how would Lamarck have explained the development of a small jaw size in snake? But before we go there, look at the first question. The first question was for you to name Lamarck's two laws. And you can see you can get 2 marks for it. Law of use and disuse. Law of inheritance of acquired characteristic. Right, that's his 2 laws. And then how would Lamarck have explained the development of the small jaw in snakes? How would Lamarck do it? He would say, since the snake's jaws were used less, remember now, they're not going to use their jaws more often because the snake's jaw has gone smaller because the toads are very big. So it's going to use the snakes will use their jaws less. Since the snake's jaws were used less or even not used at all, the snakes developed smaller jaws, and this characteristic of smaller jaws was inherited or passed on to the offsprings, and therefore all the snakes or red-bellied snakes and green snakes of today have small jaws. So here is the law of use and disuse, but more of the disuse. Okay? But you can't separate the use and the disuse. It's one law. Law of use and disuse. How did he say it? Again, the jaws of the snakes were big, and as it used its jaws less and less or less frequently, the jaws became smaller and smaller, and therefore the new generation or new offsprings inherited the smaller jaw of the snakes. And all snakes now, or all red-bellied snakes and green snakes, have smaller jaws. Now, learners, before we go to the next example, how would Darwin explain this? How would Darwin take this very same example of snakes and toads and explain the smaller jaw of the snake? He would say that the red-bellied snakes and the green-bellied snakes produce a large number of offsprings. Okay? There was variation in the jaws of the snakes. There were snakes with large jaws and there were snakes with small jaws. The snakes with large jaws ate the poisonous toads and died, and the snakes with smaller jaws could not eat the toads and survived. And therefore, the snakes with the smaller jaws were able to interbreed randomly, and the genes for smaller jaws was passed on to the offspring, and the new generation of snakes now have smaller jaws. So you must know, if you give an example, always think, how would Lamarck explain it? How would Charles Darwin explain it? So therefore here with Charles Darwin, the smaller jaws of the snakes was naturally selected to survive. Right. So let's go again here to see more questions. Remember now, when answering questions based on Lamarck's theory, that is, what's Lamarck's theory called? Lamarckism. What are the 2 laws of his? Law of use, disuse, law of inheritance of acquired characteristics. But let's look at Lamarckism. Yeah? When you're doing Lamarckism, what must you remember? You must remember, first of all, right, that an inherited characteristic is a characteristic that an offspring, when something is inherited, that offspring is born with it. It's born with it, okay? Having been inherited from one of the parents, it's controlled by a gene. So anything that's inherited is actually coming from a gene from the parents. Whereas an acquired characteristic is a characteristic that an offspring is not born with, but which develops through the course of its lifetime, and it's not controlled by a gene. So acquired characteristic is not controlled by the gene, and the organism is not born with it, but develops it throughout its lifetime. Inherited characteristic, the organism is born with the gene, and it gains the gene from its parents. So they can even ask you to tabulate the difference between an acquired characteristic and an inherited characteristic, and you need to know that, okay? So the next one, children, let us guide you on how to apply Lamarck's theory to a new situation. Always ask yourself, what was the original characteristic? In the case of the snake, the original characteristic was a large jaw of the snake, okay? Then what was the challenge? If they ate the large toad with its large jaw, it would die because that toad or frog had poisons. So the challenge is that the prey was poisonous. Next question, what did the organism do, or what characteristic was then acquired? The snake decided to use its jaws less and less and less so that it can become smaller and smaller. That's what it did, né? So that it won't be able to eat the large toad. And what was the result? The result was that now the new snakes, or the new offsprings of snakes, will all have smaller jaws and pass that on to the offspring. Then what happened to this acquired characteristic? That acquired trait of smaller jaws was passed on to its next generation of offsprings. And what was the result? That was the result that the new generation of offsprings will have smaller jaws than the previous generation. Now we're going to get another example. The more examples you know, because this is between 6 to 8 marks just on one theory. Okay, if they ask you Lamarck's and Darwin's theory, it can take a total of 12 marks. So you need to know that. So here is another example. Now read very carefully. Insects on islands. An island is a little land surrounded by water. Okay, insects on islands without trees are likely to be wingless. What is wingless? It's an insect without wings, right? Where? In which area? Without trees. So if you find an island with no trees, just land, no trees, then the insects that you find there will have no wings, okay? Because flying is dangerous for them in an area with strong winds. So understand what they are trying to tell you. That an insect, and they give you a picture of what they are talking in this case. Here is this insect. In this case, it's a fly. And they're saying that flies, right, on islands where there's no trees, those flies had no wings like this one here. Okay, because the wind was too strong. You know, remember, trees act as wind breakers. So if insects are found where there's no trees and the wind is very strong, the wind can break their wings. So you find where there's no trees, the flies didn't have wings. That's what it means here. Now, a certain island was once covered with tall trees. So many millions of years ago, there was an island where there were tall trees. Remember now, the tall trees act as windbreakers. Over the years, there has been deforestation in some areas of the island. So remember, if there were tall trees many years ago, that means the wind was not enough, because the wind was stopped by the tall trees. So those insects where there were tall trees, they had wings. But as there was deforestation, that means as trees were cut down and there were less and less trees, those flies lost their wings, okay? So on this island, insects called stoneflies have undergone natural selection. Some have wings and some do not have wings, depending on the area where they are found. So obviously, it's telling you in the first sentence that where there's no trees, there are no wings on the insect. Where there is trees, there was wings on the insect. Okay? Now, describe how Lamarck would have explained the evolution, the change, the evolution of stoneflies without wings in the areas without trees. So, how did the stonefly come about here? Yeah, right, where this area without trees. How would he explain it? So let's see. The answer would be, now it's over time, okay? So all stoneflies firstly had wings. Then due to, now remember that the trees were removed, okay, over time. So all stoneflies had wings. Then due to strong winds, that is changes in the environment, due to strong winds, since it was dangerous to fly in cleared areas, you find that they stopped flying or you stopped using their wings. So due to strong winds, the winds were very dangerous for these flies because it's going to damage their flies, the wings. It's going to the wind is going to damage their wings, okay? So therefore they stopped flying or they stopped using their wings, these flies, okay? The wings eventually became smaller and smaller and disappeared because now those flies in the windy areas were using their wings less. So eventually the wings disappeared. And because they use their wings less and less, now the flies have no wings. So this characteristic of no wings has now become an acquired. This acquired characteristic of no wings was passed on to the offspring. Then all the offsprings in the next generation had no wings. Okay? Now, Lamarck's theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristic was rejected. Why? Firstly, there's no evidence that acquired characteristics, there's no evidence, there's no supporting evidence that what you change on the outside, if I want to pull my eyelashes and make them long, it does not mean that my child is going to be born with long eyelashes. Okay? If I was inherited the gene for short eyelashes, my child will still have short eyelashes, even though I tried to pull my eyelashes to make them long in my lifetime. So remember, there is no evidence that what you change on the outside, what you acquire on the outside, can be inherited by the offspring. So there is no evidence that acquired characteristics are inherited by the offspring. Also, a second reason is that organisms did not evolve because they were determined to change, but changes took place randomly due to mutations. That is simply trying to say that new organisms are not formed because they wanted to form. But if there is a change, it took place randomly because of changes in the gene, not because the organism wanted to change it. So let us see the two reasons why Lamarck's law of inheritance of acquired characteristic was rejected. One, an acquired characteristic cannot be inherited. There's no evidence of it. Two, organisms cannot evolve because they wanted to, but changes occur randomly due to mutations. Right. An organism cannot change its DNA. We cannot change our genotype. Remember what we got on the outside, our phenotype comes from the genotype, and we cannot change our genotype. And according to Mendel, it is the genotype, the genetic composition, that determines the physical characteristic, which is phenotype, and not the other way around. So learners, please know these reasons for the rejection of the second law of Lamarck. Now we go to Charles Darwin, and now we're going to look at the main points, right? So Charles Darwin published his first book called On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. He called his book The Origin of Species, and it wanted to explain the theory of natural selection. His theory of natural selection was actually based on two main points. And that was, species were not created in their present form but evolved from an ancestral species, like whales. That the present day whale is not what existed millions of years ago. That the first whale actually had legs. So he's saying that the species that existed today is not the same as the species that existed millions of years ago, because over time there was change. Right, he called the first species an ancestral species. And he proposed, therefore, that the changes came about due to natural selection. Now, here is a little illustration to explain natural selection. And you can see here, children, that here is a butterfly, a brown butterfly, and a yellow and blue butterfly. So you can see variation in the colors of the butterfly. Now, you can see that there are two birds, and they are going to be eating the worms. Remember that these worms or larvae will actually hatch into butterflies. Okay, you can see brown larvae are going to become the brown butterflies, and you can see the green one is going to become, the yellowish green is going to become this butterfly. Now you can see that these birds are going to eat that larva or little worms or caterpillars. Now the wood itself is brown, and can you see that the three brown worms or caterpillars are surviving? There's three brown ones, and there's only one greenish bluish worm, because the brown butterflies, or the brown worms are camouflaging against the background, but this yellowish one is unable to camouflage, so the predatory birds are able to spot it easily and eat them. So the ones with the brown will survive because that's an advantageous characteristic, and the ones which cannot camouflage, it's a disadvantageous characteristic, and they will be eaten up, and eventually they all will die. And so the new generation is going to have what? Only brown butterflies. And you can see here now that you have now, here's brown butterflies and yellow butterflies. There's a competition, right, against who's going to be eating which worms, which birds are going to eat more, which worms. And you can see now from the yellow butterflies and the brown butterflies survived more because they were able to camouflage, and the frequency of brown butterflies will be more. Now let's look again at natural selection, Darwin's theory. So you can see here with these beetles that there's a great deal of variation amongst the offsprings in a population. Green beetles and orange beetles. Okay, and then you're going to see now here, some have favorable characteristics and some do not. So the green beetles seem to be a favorite one amongst these birds. Okay, you can see they say, yum, green beetles, our favorite. So the birds love the green beetles more than the orange beetles. Probably the orange beetles have a very bitter taste, and the green beetles suit the taste of these birds. So who is going to have a more favorable characteristic between the green beetles and the orange beetles will be the green beetles, right? So there's a great deal of variation amongst the offspring. Let's apply it to the beetles. We'll say there's a great deal of variation in the colors of the beetles. Then we must explain it, that there are beetles with orange color, and there are beetles with green color. The beetles with green are eaten up rapidly, and therefore eventually they will die out. The orange beetles are not eaten because they are not a favorite diet for the birds, and therefore they will survive, and therefore more orange beetles that survive will interbreed, and the new generation of offspring of beetles will all be orange. So orange color was naturally selected. You can see some have favorable characteristics, that means the orange, and some have unfavorable characteristics, that means the green color. When there's a change in the environmental conditions, such as predation in this case, or if there's competition, then the organisms with the characteristics that make them more suited. What's most suited here? The orange. What makes them more suited? Because they have a bitter taste. they would survive, whilst the organisms with unfavorable characteristics, that means they have a taste for the predatory birds, will make them less suited and they'll die because they'll all get eaten up. And then the organisms that will be eaten up less, yeah, will survive and reproduce, and therefore pass on the alleles for the bitter taste or the favorable characteristics to the offspring. And then the next generation of beetles will all have a higher proportion of being orange in color. Right. Here is another example now of Darwin. How do we apply Darwin's theory to this example? All right. So here, learners, we're going to see a population of lizards on an island A were well suited to feed on insects. So island A had lizards that fed on insects. Scientists moved 5 adult pairs of lizards to a neighboring island B. Here they reproduced and a new population was formed. Island B has a larger supply of plants with tough fibrous leaves and fewer insects. Okay, so on island A, remember, there were lizards which were suited to feed insects. Right, that means there was more insects on island A. But on island B, there was more fibrous, tough plants. So they took the lizards that used to feed insects from island A and they simply introduced it into island B, where there was more plants and less insects. Always understand the scenario they are giving you. Picture what is happening. Okay. Exposure to this new environment may have caused the lizards to undergo evolution. Now these lizards that used to like eating insects, now maybe their jaws were very small to eat insects, but now suddenly they put into a place where there's big fibrous means tough plants. Okay. 36 years later, scientists returned to island B to conduct further investigations on the lizard population. They observed that the jaw size of the lizards had increased. Scientists also analyzed the stomach content of the lizards and found it was plant-based. They confirmed that the two populations still belong to the same species. They belong to the same species, but just that there's changes in their jaw, just like the finches. Okay? So the question is, use Darwin's theory of natural selection to explain the evolution of lizards with large jaws. So what would Darwin say? First of all, he would say that lizards produce a large number of offsprings. Then he'd say there is variation in what? In the jaws of the lizards. Focus on what is being changed, the jaws of the lizards. The actual characteristic on that animal. There is variation in the size of the lizard's jaw. There's variation in the size of the lizard's jaws. Some have small jaws and some have large jaws. So you must explain that variation. Due to a larger supply of fibrous plants, or they could say, due to a larger supply of fibrous plants and less insects, right? Those with the smaller jaws were unable to feed on the large plants. And they died. So when they took those lizards with small jaws and placed them in island B where there's big tough plants, those little lizards with the small jaws couldn't feed on the large plants and they died. Okay? And then those, remember the variation, those with the large jaws were able to feed on the fibrous plants. The lizards with the larger jaws will have more food because now they can eat the tough, fibrous, long, big plants. And they survived. And therefore they were able to reproduce. And the allele for larger jaws were passed into the offsprings. And the next generation will have a higher proportion of lizards with larger jaws. So the larger jaws was a characteristic that was naturally selected. Now let's go to the next one. Again, the more you apply, you're going to get your full marks for these theories. A population of frogs lived in a pond. The frogs may be lighter or darker in color. Automatically now, we're looking at the color to be a characteristic, the variation, right? A population of herons. Okay, let's read further. A population of herons. Herons are birds, long-legged water birds. You know, they look like this normally, like that, with long little legs, okay? And here's your herons. And here's the water. Right. So a pond of frogs lived in a pond, and the frogs may be darker or lighter in color. So all over here now they were frogs, light frogs and dark colored frogs. Right. So these birds feed on the frogs that live in the same habitat. Over a period of time, the water in the pond became darker. So remember, you got dark colored frogs and light colored frogs. So over time, if the water became darker, if the water became dark and also there's dark colored frogs in the water, what's going to happen? Over time, the water in the pond became darker in color. This caused the frog population to change over time, or over four periods, over a period of 4 years. They changed over a period of 4 years. So let's look at year 1. Count. There were 2 dark colored frogs, and there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 light colored frogs. Year 2, slowly the water is becoming darker. Now in year 2 we got 4 dark colored frogs, which means the dark colored frog increased by 2 and the light colored frogs decreased by 2. In year 3 now we can see actually 6 dark colored frogs and 2 light colored frogs. So slowly, as the water became darker, the dark frogs survived. Why? Because they could not be easily spotted. They were able to camouflage against the dark water. But the light colored frogs were easily spotted by these herons and eaten away. So how would Darwin use Darwin's theory to explain how the frog population changed over a period of 4 years, from becoming more light colored to now becoming dark colored frogs? So Darwin would say there was variation in the frog population. Some of the frogs were light in color and some of the frogs were dark in color. What you're going to say? There was variation in the color of the frogs. Some frogs were dark colored, some frogs were light colored. Those that were light in color could not camouflage in the dark water, and therefore they were eaten up and they died, or they did not survive. Those that were dark were camouflaged against the dark water, and therefore they survived because they were not eaten. The dark frogs that survived, you must say, not just frogs, but the dark frogs that survived reproduced. Okay? And the allele for dark color was passed on to the offsprings, leading to a population of dark colored frogs after 4 years. That means after 4 years, the dark colored frogs were naturally selected. And here you can see example punctuated equilibrium. Just to revise it, that now it's Eldridge and Gould that propose the theory of speed at which evolution takes place. Here's it. You can see now long periods of time where there was no change. All the time the horses were shot. Suddenly there was a rapid change. Okay, and here you're going to get now explain the speed at which evolution takes place. Long period of time where there's little or no changes, and that is followed by short periods of time where there's rapid changes due to natural selection, and then new species form. And then you're going to get gradualism is equilibrium, slow and gradual changes in the species due to small changes, and punctuated equilibrium is rapid changes occurs followed by long periods of no change. So long periods of no change followed by short periods of rapid changes. That's punctuated equilibrium due to natural selection. You can see how there's long periods of no change followed by rapid changes. And here long periods of no change, and it's very, very gradual. That's gradualism. Okay. So here now, the theories of evolution, you can get a little picture like this or an illustration here. That is ideas A, B, C. Remember the 3 ideas: punctuated equilibrium, Lamarckism, right, and Darwinism by natural selection. So you've got to look at these pictures and associate it with those 3 theories. Right, let's see. What does MYA stand for? 10 MYA, 5 MYA, and present. It stands for millions of years ago. See? Give the letter of the diagram A, B, or C that would best represent punctuated equilibrium, whereby suddenly there was a big change. And what would that be, learners? That is going to be C. Can you see? It stayed the same for a long time, and suddenly it never gradually became long. It was short and suddenly became long. And that is called what? Punctuated equilibrium. So that is C. Lamarck's explanation of evolution. What's Lamarck's? That the short-necked giraffe and slowly stretched its neck and then it became longer. That is going to be Lamarck. So that's going to be A. Darwin's theory, you're going to see variation. You can see tall giraffes and short giraffes. Eventually, the short-necked giraffe died out and the ones with the long neck survived. And that is natural selection, which is B. Okay, learners? And then we're going to move on to the next part, which is going to be artificial selection. And my colleague, Mrs. Mabelo, is going to explain to you the next part of evolution. Do well, learners. Study well. The more and more you go over examples and past papers with the memorandum, you will do well. Thank you.
day, grade 12 learners, and welcome to the second session of evolution through natural selection. And thank you to my co-presenter who took you through theories of evolution. Right, I'm going to take you through the artificial selection. So the word artificial, you can think of your space. You can think of any example that relates to artificial, the word artificial. I can talk of artificial hair, you can talk of many things. Sometimes if you are a person, maybe you want to breed, you want a dog of specific characteristics, you can choose to have that dog. How can that happen? Right, we're going to continue with artificial, whereby we are saying humans have been doing breeding experiments to develop organisms. You can develop organisms with a selected set of desirable characteristics. In other words, artificial is man-made. You choose those desirable characteristics, then we call that artificial selection. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. So humans have been doing breeding experiments. Now, with the breeding experiments, you basically they're developing organisms. You select set of desirable characteristics that you want as a person. Then that is called artificial selection. Right, for an example here, if you can look at the modern corn. In prior or years ago, this is what we have. And then because we're talking of artificial man-made, these days you want to grow. It can be animals, it can be plants, you grow them faster, the OMG, right? So look at this one. If you were to choose between this one and the modern one, obviously this one will make more money because it will sell quickly because they are big. So this is man-made. And then also I'm going to give you the example of a chicken day. Look at this one and compare it to the third one. Obviously, for money to circulate, for economy, for people to buy, for you to sell, they will buy these big ones. But if you can check, originally they were so small, and probably they have injected, maybe farmers have injected to this one so that they grow quickly, so that they sell. So look at this one. Probably it will be, maybe they have injected these ones to grow faster for the economy. So this is man-made. This is artificial. All right. Now, another example there. You can breed a bulldog and a collie here, and then they can give you a wolf. So it's man-made. You can breed those. You can maybe put them in one cage, the two of them, or this one and this one. You can put them in one cage during breeding, during mating. Then you are going to get what? A wolf. So you are creating the space there. We're going to look at the differences between natural selection and artificial selection. Now, in terms of the two, what is the difference there? For an example, with natural selection there, who selects? Nature. Nature selects. Environment selects. But then if we compare it to artificial selection, who selects there? Humans represent the selective force. I hope you get the difference, girls and boys. Right. Another difference between the two, selection is in response to suitability to the environment. So nature is the driving force here. And with artificial selection, selection is in response to human needs. Like I gave you an example to say, there's this period whereby we need to buy that chicken for food, And then what will farmers do? They will make sure that they grow those quickly so that you can they satisfy your needs. That's exactly the point. And then the last difference there, it occurs within species. So natural selection occurs through species. What about artificial selection? Artificial selection may involve one or more. So, natural selection occurs within species. However, with artificial selection, it may involve one or more species, as in crossbreeding, for an example here. Right, according to exam guideline, my colleague emphasized the importance of the exam guideline. So, whatever you do, when you study for all the topics, make sure that you follow the exam guideline because it's very, very useful. It's important for your exams. Now, according to exam guideline, we're going to look at the formation of new species. How are new species formed? All right. Now, according to exam guideline, we'll be looking at the following concepts. Right now, biological species. Now, the concept means what? If we define the word species, okay, and be careful, girls and boys, not to confuse species and a population, right? Now, with a species, it's similar organisms that are capable of interbreeding to produce fertile offspring. So, similar species need to do what? Organisms that are capable of breeding, interbreeding, and producing fertile offspring. So, if you are given a species, you must think of what is organisms that can interbreed together to produce what? Fertile offspring. Now, we're going to look at the formation of new species through speciation, right? What is speciation? So, this is another new term for you. Now, with speciation, we are going to look at speciation through geographical isolation, right? So, speciation results in new species or results in the formation of what? New species. When it has taken place, it will result in what? Formation of new species, right? Now, according to exam guideline, when you are to explain speciation, what you need to do, this one, according to exam guideline, I'm going to give it to you as a general explanation of speciation. So the question might ask for a general speciation. The question might say, describe speciation. What is speciation? So in that case, it is general. So in general, how are you going to write it? They can give you for 6-7 marks, right? So speciation through geographical isolation. If a population of a single species becomes separated by what? By a geographical barrier. Look, now, it's important when you're explaining the speciation to start with the word population, because learners are getting it wrong if they talk of species from the word go. So you must indicate that it's a population of species, because if you start with species become separated by geographical barrier, definitely you are going to lose marks there. So it's if a population of a single species becomes separated by a geographical barrier, in this case a geographical barrier, if it is a general question, the geographical barrier there, it can be the river, it can be the sea, it can be the mountains, it can be the lakes. Either of those can be a barrier at this time, right? So a population of species becomes separated by a geographical barrier, and then the population will then split into two. So once the population splits into two, what are we expecting there? So there is now no gene flow between the two populations. Remember, the two populations are being separated by what? It can be those mountains, the river, the lakes, the sea, it depends, right? So once two populations separate, there will be no more gene flow between the two populations, since each population may be exposed to what? Different environmental conditions. Or you can talk of selective pressure may be different between the two populations, right? Then Natural selection occurs independently and in each of the two populations, such that the individual of the two populations become very different from each other. Now, if you can look at all these points that we have stated, if you state all those points according to exam guideline, definitely you are going to get marks for that, right? So we are saying such that individuals of the two populations become different from each other. How? Genotypically and phenotypically. So they genotypically and phenotypically become different, even if the two populations can mix again. So what will happen? Remember, they have been separated by those geographical barriers. So even if they can meet again, or even if they have to meet again, what will happen? Even if the two populations were to mix again, they will not be able to interbreed. So if they don't interbreed, what is going to happen? The two populations are now what? Two different species. They are totally different species. So this is the general explanation of speciation, right? So also we can look at speciation through geographic isolation. In one of the following, you can get an example, a scenario that can relate to Galapagos finches, Galapagos tortoises. They can give you any example in the exams. Plants on different land masses, linking it to continental drift. Remember when we started with the introduction to evolution, we touch on the continental drift, how that happens. They can give you an example of the baobabs tree in Africa and Madagascar, caused by what? By continental drift. And also the proteus in South Africa and Australia. Remember, they will be different because the two populations once separated because of what? The continental drift. Right. They can give you any example of mammals. They can give you maybe the flowers. They can give you the plants. They can give you the birds, the flightless birds and not flightless birds. So it will depend on the scenario given. So if they need the general explanation of speciation, that's how you need to write it according to the exam guideline. Then if you are given a different scenario, then you have to do what? To apply what is given to the speciation. Right. Now it is important again to, to know all those definitions, all those terminology related to, as we'll be doing many examples there. Now, example, we spoke about the species and the population so that you don't mix the two. What are species? So species are organisms that have the same characteristics, capable of random interbreeding in order to produce what? Fertile offspring. If we think of mating, right, and take the dogs can mate with a dog to produce what? A puppy. So in that case, we are saying species are organisms that have the same characteristic, capable of random interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. That is the definition of the species. Right. Now, if you can look at this on your far left, to me is my far right here. We can look at this one. This is an organism. Now, a group of organisms, they will give us a population. Can you see all those? And then group of populations, they form what? A community. In a community, we can get different species there. And then, if we look at the community, it will give us what? An ecosystem where we find plants and animals surviving there. Okay, what is a population? A population are individuals of the same species. Individuals of the same species living in the same area, okay, that can randomly interbreed. So individuals of the same species living in the same area, okay. Now we have explained speciation in our exam guideline, where we are saying Speciation is the evolutionary process. It's a process, girls and boys. Speciation is a process, okay, by which populations evolve to become distinct species. They change because of what? Evolution. Remember, what is evolution? Change over a period of time. So for speciation to take place, we will be having changes in the population. Changes in the terms of the characteristics, because we are seeing there, for the process to take place, the population will evolve, will change to become distinct new species. Okay? Now, with geographic isolation and reproductive isolation mechanism, right? So geographical isolation and reproductive isolation mechanism isolate the gene pool of a species, resulting with formation of what? New species. All right? Okay, let us look at speciation. Remember, it is a process. Right? Now, when we talk about the process here, organisms are going to evolve. When they evolve, they will end up giving what? New, distinct species. All right? So, immediately when the question asked requires you to explain speciation, think of what? First, think of original population. So, this is our original population. For speciation to take place, remember, population is going to be divided into two, or there will be formation of geographical barrier to separate this original population. So this is a population. Now we have formation of geographical barrier. Remember, generally we say geographical barrier can be the river, can be the lake, can be, you can speak of the mountains, all right? You can talk of the sea, the ocean, that is geographical barrier. So formation of geographical barrier, it will separate the population. This initially it was one population. Because of the formation of geographical barrier, the population is now separated into two. Then what are we having? Can you see? After geographical barrier, we have what? Separation of two populations. Now we have got, immediately when we have got two populations being formed, what are we expecting? There is no gene flow between those two populations. Let's go back again. Right? For speciation to take place, which is a process that is going to give us distinct species, what happens? You think of one population, and that one population is going to be split by formation of the geographical barrier. It can be split by the river, by the lakes, by the ocean. Then what is going to happen? It is going to result into two different populations. Now, what is going to happen? There will be no gene flow between the two populations, right? There will be no gene flow between the two populations. Then what is going to happen? Let's check. We are going to have formation of what? New, distinct species. Can you see? These are totally new. That is speciation. Right? Again, look at geographic isolation there. Now, for speciation to take place, we had what? We had formation of geographical barrier. Okay, let's say this is the sea. Now, the sea is going to separate the two populations. Can you see? We now have two populations, right? So these are, immediately when we've got two populations being separated through by geographical barrier, then what is going to happen? There is no gene flow. They will never meet because they are being separated to their different space. So no gene flow between two populations, and new distinct species are going to be formed, right? Now, with mechanism of speciation, let's look for an example. We've got these finches, right? This one is long. Okay, this beak is long. This one is thin and long. This one is short and big. Obviously, these are same characteristics, but they are performing different functions because of what? Adaptation. All right. Now, mechanism of speciation. If a population of a single species becomes separated by, I'm applying that speciation, right? If a population of a single species becomes separated by geographical barrier, that is, this is geographical barrier, then the population will split into two, is another mark. If you were to be asked a question to describe the process, there is no gene flow between the two populations. We have demonstrated that. Since each population may be exposed to different environmental conditions or selection pressure may be different, then natural selection occurs independently in each of the two populations. All right? Right, such that individuals of two populations become very different from each other because they were separated, they are adapting to their environment. Then a mating is going to take place separately, so leading into two different populations, right? So what is going to happen? The two populations will become different from each other, okay? Then genotypically and phenotypically. So it is important to state all flow, have that flow, because once you mix the events there, you might lose the marks there. So follow exam guideline in describing mechanism of speciation. So such individuals of the two populations become different genotypically and phenotypically. Even if the two were to mix again, remember they were once separated. Should they mix again, what do you think will happen? They will not be able to interpret. They cannot interpret. Then the two populations are now different species. Okay. Now we are applying the recipe. You are given a question to explain the process of speciation. You look at or you study what is given. Okay, in this case, we are given, this is a paper from November 2020, I'm sorry. Don't forget, this is paper 2. All right, I'm reading the scenario that is given. Then we are going to apply the recipe. All right. So the potters and lemurs are small mammals. They are mammals. Is a scenario given. Scientists believe that potters and lemurs share common ancestor that existed in Africa. So this is Africa. So common ancestor comes from Africa, right? Presently. So scientists believe that potters and lemurs share common ancestor, meaning in ancient days or long time ago, in east coast of Africa, we could only find the potters and the lemurs, right? Now, presently, potters only occur in Africa. Presently, now, you can only find potters in Africa. We can only find lemurs in Madagascar. So you can ask yourself, what separated the two? Remember, this is speciation. Now, this is Indian Ocean. So, Indian Ocean separated the two populations. Once we had a population in Africa, but speciation took place. There was separation of population by geographical barrier. In this case, our geographical barrier is what? The Indian Ocean. It's the ocean. All right. So presently, potters and lemurs occur in Africa, while lemurs are only found in Madagascar. That's what I've just said. Madagascar is an island on the east coast of Africa, as shown in the diagram. Okay. We are going to tackle some questions. Don't forget, initially, years back, ancestors of potters and lemurs were found in Africa. Then that was one population. And then through geographical barrier, which is the ocean, it separated that population into two. Now we only find potters here we only find lemurs here in Madagascar, right? Let's look at the question. Describe the speciation of the pothos and lemurs to become different species. This is for 6 marks. Describe the speciation of the pothos and lemurs to become different. Remember, we have explained that structure. So I'm going to compare when you are applying the general rule according to exam guideline. In this case, we are being given a scenario of the pothos and lemurs, right? This is application to the question. This is when it is just general, okay? Now, when it's general and you are describing speciation, let's check. If a population of a single species becomes separated by sea, river, lake, there is no gene flow, okay, between the two populations. It's important also so that you don't lose your marks. The population splits into 2, then there will be no gene flow between the two populations, since each population may be exposed to different environmental conditions. So this is a general description of speciation. Coming to application of the content that we were given earlier on. So application to the question. Remember, we are talking about the lemurs and the pothos, right? Now, the common ancestors became separated into 2 groups by ocean. And if you can check, in most of the cases when you are given a scenario, you must be specific. So in this case, we cannot talk of the sea, we cannot talk of the river, we cannot talk of the mountain, because in that scenario, in that case, we were given that it was Indian Ocean. So the common ancestor became separated into 2 groups by the ocean. Then there was no gene flow between the 2 groups. They are separated. Then each group experienced different environmental conditions. I hope you understand that. Remember, they were separated by what? Indian Ocean. Obviously, they are growing that side. They are growing, they are growing independently. So each group experienced different environmental conditions. Okay, so we are continuing to apply that recipe. We continue from where we left. Natural selection occurs independently in each of the 2 populations, such that individuals of the 2 populations become very different from each other because there is no gene flow, right? They become different from each other genotypically and phenotypically. So if you can look at all those points, each point you can equate it to a mark. So it's important to have all those points for you to get the 6 marks there. The 2 populations are now different species. Remember, they were separated. Even if the 2 species were to mix again, what will happen? They will not be able to interpret. Okay? Right. Now, if we continue with the application, taking it from here, they underwent natural selection independently. Remember, they have separated the pothos and the lemurs. The individuals in each group become different. We talk about pothos, we talk about lemurs. We can't say potolemurs, right? They each become different genotypically and phenotypically to form what? The pothos and lemurs. Eventually, if the 2 groups are to be mixed again, what will happen? They cannot interbreed. They cannot produce fertile offspring. Remember, in order for us to get fertile offspring, organism must be of the same, right? Those species must be the same in order to give fertile offspring, right? We are recapping. Now, when we introduced evolution, we explained what biogeography means, okay? Right. Now, for continental drift to take place, think of what? For continental drift to take place, we once had what? Years back ago, we had a big landmass, which we call the Pangaea. You cannot distinguish the continents there. Now, because of continental drift, it separated the Pangaea into what? Into Laurasia. This one will be Laurasia and Gondwanaland, right? Now, today, we no longer talk of Pangaea, but we have the modern world where you can see all the continents. Okay, now the effect of continental drift in this case on biogeography is that it provides evidence for evolution of what? Ancient species. For example, flightless birds. Look at this. These are flightless birds. They are all birds. Flightless birds, right? Now, with the flightless birds in the southern hemisphere, we find all these flightless birds in different continents, right? Think of what? Adaptation here, all right? Now, from the November 2021 paper, this was the question that was posed: the present day distribution of three closely related species. Okay, three closely related. This is a dog, this is a dog, this is a dog, right? Coyote are found here, and the jackal, and here we find the dingo, right? So distribution of three closely related species of the dog family, the coyote, the jackal, the dingo, is shown in the world map below, right? These are dogs closely related. Now, what type of evidence for evolution is represented there? Remember, they were found in different continents, right? So the type of evidence for evolution there is biogeography. Now, describe how these three species could have evolved from common ancestor, right? For speciation to take place as a process, you think of what? Common ancestor. You think of what? Geographical barrier. You think of what? Formation of new species, right? Describe how these three species could have evolved from a common ancestor. Those were three related dogs, right? Don't forget. Now, the original population or common ancestor once lived in a large continent. So we are applying the continental drift. Remember, we are revising the continental drift. So we had Pangaea, Laurasia, Gondwanaland. Then we have the modern world, right? Now, in the modern world, we have placed all those related dogs in different continents. So describe how these three species could have evolved from common ancestor. So what we are saying there is the original population once lived in one large continent. Think of what? All right? One large continent, then, and became separated by continental drift. In this case, we saw the ocean, and then there was no gene flow. If there was no gene flow, each population experienced different environmental conditions and underwent natural selection independently. The individuals in each population became different and genotypically and phenotypically, right? Even if the three, remember we gave you an example of three related dogs. So you need to relate to the scenario given. You need to relate to the information that is given, right? Even if the three populations are mixed again, they would not be able to do what? To interbreed or to produce fertile offspring, forming the different species called the coyote, the jackal, and the dingo, right? Now, as examples of speciation due to continental drift again, take for an example, this is a baobab tree from Australia, from South Africa, from Madagascar. If you look at their characteristics, if you look at the formation, how they are totally different, but they are all what? Baobab trees. Because of continental drift, they ended up being different, new formed species. They are different. Okay. Now, also, we've got an example of good speciation due to continental drift. These are proteas from Australia and South Africa. They are totally different. Okay. Even if they were to be mixed again, they won't interbreed. Right. Mechanism of reproductive isolation. We'll be looking at barriers that will prevent what? Reproduction to take place. So it is breeding at different times of the year, species-specific courtship, plant adaptation to different pollinators in fertile offspring, and prevention of fertilization. So if we had enough time, I will go through each one of it. Right. The last question, reproductive isolation mechanism. That is RIM, reproductive isolation mechanism. Right. It's important to understand also what is given in the paragraph here. Right. So read carefully to answer the question, because this remarks, the answers comes from the paragraph given. Right. So when scientists mated a male lion with a female tiger, the resulting offspring was called liger, from the lion, the word lion and tiger. In nature, interbreeding between these different species is prevented by prevention of fertilization of the egg. Okay? Now, differences in behavior and by non-biological factors such as differences in range. Usually, male ligers and many female ligers that arise by accident do not develop functional sex cells. Such hybrid sterility prevents the formation of what? Viable or fertile offspring. So each time when you are given an insert paragraph like this one, or essays like this one, so you must know that questions, the coming question, definitely answers will be found from the insert. This RIM prevents the formation of hybrids between numbers of different populations and reduces the viability, fertility of hybrids. Now, let's look at the question. Name 3 reproductive isolating mechanisms in the passage above. So you can get those 3 marks free, as long as you read there with understanding. So we have prevention of fertilization is from the graph there, the paragraph there, and then differences in behavior also, you got it from the paragraph given, and also non-biological factors or differences in range or infertile offspring. So these are reproductive isolating mechanism from the passage. Okay. Thank you so much, girls and boys. And then I want to wish you good luck as you are revising your work, as you are revising your term 1 and 2 work, and also as we are going to prepare for your prelims. Good luck. And I know evolution takes 54 marks of paper 2, so you really need those marks. Okay, good luck and thank you.